Chapter 23 of the Life of Saint Teresa. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anne Boulay. The Life of Saint Teresa by Teresa of Jesus, translated by the Reverend John Dalton. Chapter 23. The saint resumes the history of her life, and tells us how she began to aim at higher perfection, and the means she employed for this purpose. I now wish to return to the place where I left off speaking of my life, for I have dwelt on other matters longer I think than I ought, in order that what is now to follow may be better understood. Henceforth this will be another new book. I mean, another new life. Hitherto it was my life, but since I began to explain these points respecting prayer, the life I have lived since then is that when God lived in me, as far as seemed to me, because otherwise I consider it impossible for me to have left off, in so short a time, such evil customs and actions. May our Lord be praised for having delivered me from myself. When I began to avoid the occasions of sin, and to give myself more to prayer, our Lord began also to confer favors upon me, as one who desired I should be willing to receive them. His Majesty then began to give me very commonly the prayer of quiet, and often that of union, which continued a very long time. But when I learnt that at this time there happened great illusions and deceits to certain women, which came from the devil, I became very afraid, considering what great delight and sweetness I felt, and that often I could not avoid such things, though on the other side I saw in me cause for very great security, viz., that all came from God, especially when I was in prayer. I saw also that I was much improved by these favors, and acquired much greater strength. But when a little distraction came upon me, I began to fear again whether the devil might not be desirous of making me imagine that it were good to suspend the understanding, and so deprive myself of the exercise of mental prayer, and that I might not be able to meditate on the Passion, nor make use of my understanding. And this seemed a great loss to me. But as His Majesty was now pleased to give me light, in order that I might no more offend Him, and might see how much I was indebted to Him, this fear increased on me in such a manner as to make me diligently search for some spiritual persons, with whom I could speak on the affairs of my soul. Already I had heard of some, for some fathers of the Society of Jesus had come into Spain, and for this order I had great regard, without however knowing any of the fathers, for the sole reason of my knowing the kind of life and prayer they practiced. But I did not consider myself worthy to speak with them, nor strong enough to obey them, and this gave me great fear, because to treat with them on spiritual matters, and yet to remain as I was, seemed to me very foolish and wrong. Amidst such thoughts as these I passed some time, till at last by the contest I endured inwardly, and through my fears which I still had, I resolved to state my case to a spiritual man, to ask him what he thought of the kind of prayer I used, and to enlighten me if he found I was in error. I also resolved to use all possible diligence not to offend God. Through my want of courage I became more and more timid. O my God, what a great error it was in me to separate myself from my God in order to become good! In this point the devil labors much, when we are beginning to acquire virtue, because I could not conquer myself herein. He, the devil, knows well, that the sovereign means of doing good to a soul is to seek advice from those who are the friends of God, and thus I could not fix on any time to resolve upon this. I expected to reform myself first, as I had done before when I left off prayer, and perhaps I should never have accomplished my object, for I had already fallen so deeply into certain bad habits, which I did not know were evil, that it was necessary for me to be assisted by some one else, in order to raise me up. Blessed be our Lord, for His own hand was the first to help me. When I now perceived my fears to increase so much, because I was more given to prayer, it seemed to me that there was either some great good, or some very great evil involved in my case, because I was already well aware that my prayer was supernatural, since sometimes I was not able to resist it, and even when I wished to obtain it, I could not. I accordingly thought that there would be no remedy for me, if I did not endeavor to keep a pure conscience, and to avoid every occasion of sin, even venial ones. If my prayer came from the Spirit of God, the benefit would be evident; but if from the devil, he could do me no hurt at all, but rather he would suffer loss, if I endeavored to please God and not to offend Him. Having resolved upon this, and always beseeching our Lord to assist me, though I continued this same course for several days, yet I found my soul had not strength enough to arrive at such perfection of herself, on account of some affection and inclination I still had for certain things, which though not very bad in themselves, yet were sufficient to spoil everything. A certain priest in this place was mentioned to me, who was a learned man, and whose virtue and good life our Lord began to discover to the public. I accordingly endeavored to become acquainted with this ecclesiastic, by means of a holy individual who lived in the same town. This gentleman was married, but his life was so exemplary and virtuous, and so charitable was he and given to prayer, that all men admired his goodness and perfection; and with reason, because many souls obtained great good through his means, and by the excellent abilities he had; for though they did not assist him in increasing his fortune, still he did not refuse to employ them for the good of others. He had an excellent understanding, and was mild and kind to everyone. His conversation was not troublesome, but so sweet and agreeable, as well as just and holy, that everyone was delighted who spoke to him. He directed all things for the greater good of those souls with whom he conversed, and, indeed, he seemed to have no other aim or desire, but to give pleasure to everyone, and to do all for them that they allowed him. Now I do believe that this holy and blessed man, by his care and attention, was chiefly instrumental in the salvation of my soul. I am astonished at his humility in wishing to see me, for I think he had spent little less than 40 years in the practice of mental prayer, perhaps not quite so long by 2 or 3 years, and he led a life of perfection, such as his station seemed to allow. His wife was also a great servant of God, and so charitable, that he lost nothing by her. In fine, he chose her for his wife as being one whom God knew to be fit for so great a servant of his. Some of his kindred were married to some relations of mine. I was likewise well acquainted with another great servant of God, who was married to a cousin of mine, and by means of this person, I managed that this priest, who was his great friend, and such a great servant of God likewise, should come and speak with me, for I intended to make my confession to him, and take him for my director. The gentleman then before mentioned, having introduced me to him, I was extremely confused to see myself in the presence of so holy a man. I gave him, however, an account of my life and prayer, for he excused himself from hearing my confession, saying that he was then very busy, and so he was. He began with a holy resolution to guide me, as he would one who was strong, and I ought to have been so, considering the kind of prayer I believed I was using, and this he did that I might not offend God in any way whatever. But I was much troubled when I soon perceived what his resolution was with regard to those little practices which, as I have said, I had not the courage to leave off immediately in a perfect manner. And when I also saw that he meant to settle the affairs of my soul as it were all at once, then I was convinced that I stood in need of much more care and consideration. In a word, I clearly understood that the means he prescribed were not those which would supply a remedy, for they were only fit for a more perfect soul than mine. And though, as regards myself, I had advanced by having received favors from God, yet I was but just beginning to acquire virtue and mortification. And I certainly believe that if I had had no one else to consult with but this person, my soul would never have improved, because, through the affliction it gave me to see how I did not and could not, as I thought, do that which he told me, it was enough to make me despair and give up everything. Sometimes I wonder that as this holy priest had a particular faculty in winning souls to God, His Majesty was not pleased to give him a knowledge of my soul, nor to allow him to take care of it. But now I see that this all happened for my greater good, that so I might come to know and converse with such holy men, as they are who belong to the Society of Jesus.